Good evening, everybody. Buenas noches. It's really great to share this evening with you. We will be together for about 60 minutes or less. We are featuring our colleagues this evening who have made the transition from assistant or associate teacher roles to head teacher positions in elementary divisions within our schools. And so they're going to answer some questions. They're going to share from their own experiences. They're going to talk about some of the magic that has happened, some of the support they've experienced, and they're also going to offer their wisdom and advice to you. So if you've joined this evening and are live, feel free to send messages directly to me. My name is Liz Fernandez. I am the job fair administrator, and I have been affiliated with NYSAIS since 2000 in this role. And in the early 90s, the job fair is how I ended up in the independent school community. So it is a very important service that the New York State Association of Independent Schools provides for everyone, schools, families, colleagues, and especially and most importantly, our children. So I'm really delighted to be here. In a moment, I'm going to ask my colleagues and panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll launch right in. If you are watching this live, I started to say, please send using the chat a message directly to me. I'm happy to answer the questions that you are most interested in getting, and I'll leave those to near the end because we've got a slate of questions. If you are watching this not live at your leisure, we're so glad you are. We hope this is helpful. If there's any additional questions that you have in advance of the job fair to promote diversity, which will take place on Saturday, February 26th from 10 to 2 virtually from the comfort of your own spaces. We have over 100 schools registered, and we're really excited to launch this conversation for the 33rd annual successful transition from assistant associate teacher to head teacher. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves. And I would love for you to start with just how did you go from either undergrad or graduate programs or whatever field you were in to the independent school community? What was your transition? How did you end up in the independent school world? I'm going to invite Michael to go first, Mallory to go second, and Domingo to go third, and then we'll circle back and we'll just keep flowing for the evening. Looking forward to it. By all means, let's go.
Hi, good night, everyone. My name is Michael Nelson. I currently teach at Williamsburg Northside School in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but my introduction to the independent school world happened in middle school, when I was in middle school. I'm an alum of Prep for Prep, which when I was going to middle school in my public school in the Bronx, I started at Prep for Prep and went through that whole program and then ended up at collegiate. So, I got the taste of what independent school life was like as a student. Then went off to college and was in a number of other fields. I worked at a tech startup. I was a freelance writer, and then eventually I got back into independent school. I was coaching at collegiate. I was coaching basketball at collegiate, and then I decided to someone led me to Brandy Clark, who works with the independent school and placing teachers of color in independent schools. She then brought me to the job fair, and I got linked up with Grace Church School, and it's been a journey. I was an associate for about 5 years, and yeah, through to many different schools and to where I'm at now.
Great, I'll go next. Hi, my name is Mallory Hom. I am a lower school learning specialist at Poly Prep Country Day School, also in Brooklyn. This is my first year. I just made the transition from lead teacher to learning specialist. Prior to Poly Prep, I worked at the school at Columbia University for 6 years as a lead teacher. But to begin with, what Liz was saying, I went to, my undergraduate degree was in childhood education. And I knew that after I wanted to obviously become a teacher and I wanted to focus in New York City. I grew up in a public school education, so I was very new to the independent school world. And my actual first year of teaching was at a charter school in Brooklyn. And it was a new school. I was a new teacher, and it was a year full of challenges. And I wanted to sort of make the transition to a school that had developed their own identity, had some history behind them, so I could continue to learn and grow that way. So I was also an associate teacher for 5 years in total. After the charter school, I was an associate teacher at Friends Seminary for 2 years. And then I worked at the Browning School for 1 year, which was a very different experience, an all boys school. And then I worked at the Churchill School and Center, which is a school that focuses on children, serves children with learning disabilities, specifically language-based disabilities. And there, I was really able to hone my interest in working with children who have learning differences. And after that, I made the transition to becoming a lead teacher at Columbia, also working with Brandy Clark, who brought me to she's great. I went to the job fair and really had so many positive experiences with the NYSAIS job fair, and they've been so helpful during that time.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Domingo Paulino. I'm currently a first grade head teacher over at Riverdale Country School at the lower school. My journey to independent schools began at the Westside YMCA. I was working there at a program, a nursery school. And I always had people coming up to me telling me, like, you have something in you that's a little bit more than just a regular teacher. And I'd never really had any desire to really truly be a teacher as a career. And then the more time that I spent with kids, I just found that there was something there that I couldn't really let go of. And I actually left the profession for a while to do some like grant foundation kind of things. And it was just like not fulfilling anymore to me. And so I found my way to ethical culture through someone who actually worked at the YMCA during summer camp. Her name was Jerry Gaddetti, who's been teaching for over 20 years now over at Ethical. And she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And so I give a lot of credit to her. And I think that journey and being in a school, I'm a public school kid, was born in Jersey and spent a lot of time in the Bronx growing up. So I never really had any glimpse into this independent school world. And so once I got in there and I saw what it looks like to be, a progressive educator, what does it mean to, follow the lead of the children in the classroom, it really changed my perspective of what it could mean to be a teacher as a career. And then through the job fair also, I found my way through to Riverdale Country School. So there's a lot of different connection points for me, and just really excited to be here.
Thank you all. I am so thrilled to know that the job fair played some role, and certainly our colleagues at Faculty Diversity Search through Interschool, we've had a longstanding partnership with them, and I'm thrilled to know that for some of you that was also a key partnership as well. So you've been both Michael and Mallory spoke about being in an assistant or associate teacher role for about 5 years. Dom, how long were you an assistant or associate teacher?
Yeah, I forgot that part. It was actually the same amount of time. I was an associate teacher for about 5 years, I believe. And I think that was a really important time to spend in that role, and then sort of transition then after that into a head teacher role.
So that's great, because there's an opportunity for you all to have enough reflection that you've been removed to really think about in what ways, when describing a typical day, in what ways is the role of an assistant or an associate teacher different from the head teacher position. So if you could think about, we know that there's no such thing as a typical day, like, let's be real, and we're all living and surviving through the uncertainties of this global health pandemic. So we understand that. That being said, what are some of the elements of your day now in your lead role that are significantly different from being a head teacher? Mallory, would love for you to start, and then Domingo, you'll go second, and Michael third.
Sure, I'd love to speak about that. I think for me, being an associate teacher really depended on my relationship with my lead teacher. And I've been in a lot of different schools and working with some really fantastic lead teachers who are all very different in their philosophies and their practices and in the school environment itself. So I think if you're a newer associate teacher, I remember doing a lot of observing, a lot of watching what my teacher was modeling, maybe taking on a part of a lesson after she's modeled it or he has modeled it. And then as a more experienced associate teacher, you might be designing units. You might be drafting letters to parents. You might be thinking about what your end of the year narrative is going to look like going through that process. So there's so much time in your practice. It to really think of it as a practice, you're asking a lot of questions, you're doing a lot of reflecting and a lot of planning with your lead teacher. And as a lead teacher who's mentored associate teachers, you're coming at it from a very different way. As a lead teacher, you're thinking back, you already have questions generating in your brain based on what your kids are showing in this math lesson. You're like, oh, I might have to change this up. Whereas an associate teacher, you might not even know what questions to ask yet, but that you're gaining that experience to think about it. And of course, as a lead teacher, you have, I think, the weight of the responsibility on your shoulders. You're the one who is modeling that relationship between how you communicate to the parents, how you communicate with your children, the role that you're sharing that way.
Yeah, one of the big things for me this year has been this idea of responsibility. There's a lot on our shoulders. When those children walk into your room, they're yours for that period of time that you have them. And that's a huge responsibility. I think that's the biggest difference for me, understanding that every day I need to make sure that these children's needs are met, not only academically, but socially, emotionally, that I'm there for these children and in the ways that I never anticipated as an associate teacher, just simply because I feel like I worked a lot more one-on-one with children or in small groups. And now I need to make sure that the entire classroom is going along. I'm building community. I'm making sure that I'm reaching these kids individually, but also as a class. And I think that's something that it's hard to explain because a lot of it is a very much an intuitive thing. It's an emotional thing with these children that you're building these relationships with. And it's something that in many ways you have to experience. So I think in many ways, what Mallory was saying, this idea of asking questions has been a huge benefit to me as an associate and then transitioning into a head teacher position where you're asking these questions about like, how are you thinking about this? How are you thinking about the class, right? So you're not just thinking about students, you're thinking about the class. And I think that's a completely different perspective shift that sometimes you're not even ready for, right? Like you have to experience. So I think that's, to me, is the biggest part. And then also, I think the time that you have to put into like have meetings with people about curriculum, have meetings with parents about things that you're noticing are things that as an associate teacher, you're just never really going to be privy to, just simply because that's not your role, right? That's not your responsibility. So those are to me the big things that stand out.
That was great. I think one of the big things for me that was a difference was, I guess, being responsible for classroom culture. I think, I've similarly in many different places, I've worked with a lot of experienced head teachers who knew, whose language was so well cultivated, who were able to take control of a space, a classroom of, 17, 20 kids or what have you, depends on your school. And, as an associate,
Get off, get down.
As an associate, you kind of step into that, right? And you are there kind of assisting that lead teacher with kind of the building of that culture. But as a head, you're setting the tone. Your language is your demeanor is what kids, mostly feed off of. And what thinking about who you want to be in the space, your as a person, your identity, what do you want to bring forth? I know at times as an associate, they're even more so as in my fourth or fifth year as an associate, I was like, how would I want this? I was starting to think, how would I want this classroom to be like, right? Like what would be some ways that I would want to put my imprint? What were some things I would change? And I got to, when I finally got my chance, I got to do many of those things. And I'm glad that I can, I can have my personality be kind of, the thing that guides the classroom in a sort of way. So thinking about who you want to be authentically in the space is when you're in charge is an important thing.
Thank you. I know that when you were each in your associate or assistant teacher positions, there were additional responsibilities that you took on as ways to learn, to grow, to develop skills, to gain exposure, to explore leadership opportunities. Quite frankly, in some cases, they probably provided a stipend or some sort of remuneration to increase the salary. So can you think about some of the key decisions that you made, or key additional components that you took on that were really helpful for you in developing to be the role that you're in now as a head teacher? Because in some ways that might be good advice for somebody who's listening to this, to just think about, how do you think strategically for the right now and for the 1, 2, 3 years from now? I would love for Domingo to respond, Michael to go second, and then Mallory.
It's a great question. And I think the point about thinking a year, 2, 3 ahead is something that I never really thought of until I had like people around me that saw something in me to start thinking about, like, hey, what are you thinking about, right? Like, what steps are you taking to make sure that when it is time for you to search for that job, that you have something to say, that you have something to, an experience to share, right? And I think for me, a couple of pivotal points were the People of Color Conference, having the opportunity to go there and to hear from amazing educators, to feel what it means to be a part of a teaching culture that cares about students, that cares about promoting diversity and of thought and of so many different things and perspectives. I think that changed a lot for me. It really made me feel like I was a person that's trying to make a career out of this thing called teaching, right? And so that was a big shift for me. And so it became more of a like, this is fun, this is interesting, into more like, this is something I care about and I'm going to spend time doing, right? And I think that's an important shift when you're going from an associate to a head teacher, is like, it actually takes a lot of time, of your own time, not just school time, not just work time, but time of your own to study, to think about the things that you want to be and the things that you want to say in the classroom. And I think that was a big shift for me. And then another piece was I was lucky to work at a school that had a sister school in Kenya, in Africa. And that was a huge shift for me to be able to experience a school in a completely different environment, where most of the time you were teaching practically just with your teaching self, right? So there wasn't an abundance of materials, there wasn't an abundance of understanding language wise. So you really had to get to the core of what it means to be a teacher and how do you teach students, right? At the most basic level. And I think those two experiences for me were really shift my perspective of what it meant to be a teacher. And then along with that, the conversations that I had with people who had more experience than I did. And I think going back to this idea of asking questions, and sometimes you're not quite sure what the questions are, but just being in those spaces allows you to at least listen first, right? And then you can start thinking about, what do I want to ask? What do I want to know? And I think those two things for me were huge.
Thank you, Domingo, for mentioning POCC. And I think, along with that is the idea of professional development. As an associate, you depending on the school you're a part of, where you're coming from, like take advantage of as much professional development as they'll allow. Most of the time, a lot of times your school will pay for it up front, or you might have to invest and then they'll reimburse you or what have you. But I remember my first year teaching, going to the Beginning Teachers Institute, and I mean, the brain conference at Mohonk, and getting lots of resources at a lot of these different conferences that I could use in the classroom. So much stuff things that I use still, like a book about of energizers that I use with my kids between classes, where they just get them up and moving. Games that I learned my first year teaching that I'm still using now in my 8th year teaching. Lots of professional development where you learn. You'll go to these things that are like a day, 2 days, 3 days, and all it takes is one thing that you can bring with you that kind of shifts your practice a little bit. That can and it looks really good on your resume. I'd also say schools like to bring people who can contribute to their culture in many ways, and I think you know, my background, you know, being able to coach was helpful as well, you know, in having a sports background. Um, was really good. And you know, and so bringing your own the things you enjoy, the skills you have that you can give to kids, right, that you can teach students, is a good thing as well.
Michael, I just want to reiterate the professional development. For me as an associate teacher, I really use that time and those stipends to pay for graduate school. So I got my first master's degree when I was associate teacher. When I worked at Churchill, they had a special education extension program where a college professor in a university they were associated with would come in twice a week, and all the associates would get trained in that graduate program. So it's an extra 12 credits for my learning special or my special education certification. So really take advantage of all the potential professional development opportunities. Finish your degree, get your extension, just show that you want to keep learning and growing. I think that's really powerful.
In addition to what you all have said, and yes, I agree on the professional development front and the value, and it's both the ones that are sponsored by the school, in particular on those professional development days, the grade level, the department, the age level, all of those conversations are great. And then also the additional ones where there is funding for you to explore external institutes, conferences, webinars. I mean, you know, whatever is available that will further your learning and growth. I mean, so many of our schools really talk about wanting to create lifelong learners and students. And, you know, you all talk about how critically important it is to model for our students how to engage, how to participate, how to build community. Well, we also can model what does it mean to be a lifelong learner as well. I wanted to add, and this is one of those, put it in your pocket, remember this. I think one of the best professional development experiences that anybody can ever have in any role is to participate in a search committee for a actually understand the process of hiring and what does it mean? What is an equitable and inclusive process look like? Reviewing resumes, creating rubrics, coming up with questions, listening, deliberating with colleagues, assessing needs, making recommendations. I cannot say that enough. And if you haven't, if the three of you haven't, I hope that you will sometime soon. If you are listening, I hope that at some point you will, because you will understand the process very differently. You'll understand how to present yourself very differently. And you'll also understand the nuances of being the internal candidate versus the external candidate, and the value of internal wisdom versus new eyes wisdom. So with that, I'm super curious. You know, there's a relevant question that I think is really important that people wanna sort of explore. And that's, how did you indicate that you were ready? You were ready to pursue that head teacher position. How, you know, first, what was going on for you internally, you know, those conversations, those moments, and then how did you indicate in, you know, at your job? How did you indicate in the interview process? You know, there's multiple layers to that, but how did you show readiness is really the question. Michael, kick us off, and then Mallory and Domingo.
Sure. I think when at my last year of associate teaching, you know, I really wanted to take on a lot more responsibility. I wanted to lead at least half of the the conferences that were taking place, and writing them and speaking to students' strengths. I during my interview processes, one thing two things that stick out to me were being able to express my knowledge of different curriculum, having been at different places, and experienced different ways of teaching math, Singapore math versus context for learning versus this versus that. right? Being able to speak to the nuances of those things, and you know, I guess having at that point, you know, I'd been through grad school as well, so like, you know, school being having gone through grad school, that also gave me some more information in terms of like, you know, the pedagogy, the theory behind teaching and how people teach and the differences. And also being able to speak to like the development of students and how do I, you know, if I'm teaching second graders, which I teach now, right? What do I know about 7 and 8 year olds that makes me, you know, capable and able to meet them where they are and teach them in particular, right? What's different about third graders? What's different about fourth graders? And so being able to know curriculum and know, you know, developmentally where students are at and how to meet them where they're at.
During my last year, when I was interviewing to become a lead teacher, during the interviewing process, I was really clear about what I wanted the associate experience for me to look like. I always was using it as a stepping stone to become a lead teacher. That was always the next step. So as an associate teacher, why was I doing this job? I wanted to learn how to become a lead teacher. I wanted to learn how to run a classroom management. I wanted to learn curriculum development. I wanted to learn what was developmentally appropriate. I wanted to learn theory and pedagogy, and also gain the experience of collaborating with other teachers, running classrooms, participating in the daily life of what it means to be a lead teacher. So every day as an associate was that next step. And when I was ready for it, I was able to reflect back, as Michael said, on everything how I grew during the past 5 years, but also the areas where I felt comfortable. But I also was able to reflect on my challenges and things I still want to work on. Because when you're making that leap, the hiring committee doesn't want to hear like, oh, I know everything. That's not reflective. That's not thoughtful. They want to say like, you know, I'm still working on this, but I'm ready to learn and grow and collaborate and hear feedback. So I was always really clear about what the associate experience for me was supposed to be like.
I had a similar experience in my last year before I transitioned over to Riverdale, where there was a position open, a first grade head teaching position open. And I had anticipated that this might happen. And so I started to make sure that I was getting into those PDs, right? Those math PDs, those literacy PDs, so that I can show that I was preparing myself, right, for another step. And not only were those actually helpful, but it also signaled that I was ready, right? That I was making my way there, right? And so that to me is a big part of it. And then going back to this idea of surrounding yourself with people that you can listen to and ask questions, right? It also goes back into being this active person, right? So in your team meetings, right? In your school meetings, do you have something to say? Do you have something of value to add to the conversation? And people are going to start noticing these things, right? So it's not just the idea that you're going to say something at a meeting, but are you adding value to the conversation, right? And from that comes from listening, right? That comes from asking questions, that comes from spending time at PDs, and then also doing your work on your own time. And so that to me is this idea of adding value to a conversation. It goes a long way, especially if you're trying to apply to the same school that you're working at currently. And in terms of outside schools is also this idea of what did you do in your time at your school, right? So what committees were you a part of? What PDs did you take, you know? And so how can you add value to the communities that you're coming into is what I think.
Excellent, excellent wisdom that you've just shared. I hope you all are taking notes because there's really good information here for the short and long term. I would be really interested in hearing, what did your job search look like when you were looking for head teacher positions? What steps do you remember taking during this time to stand out against other, you know, amongst the other candidates, regardless of whether it was internal or external? So what did that process look like? Michael, if you could speak first, Domingo second, and then Mallory third, that'd be great.
What in my job search, you know, so, you know, all this time of this COVID, you know, it's hard to even remember sometimes, but I remember thinking about like thinking about where I wanted to be and what was the environment that I wanted to be in. My first head teaching job outside of after associate teaching was actually a co-teaching position. I think And so I worked, I was with another head teacher. And so I wanted that experience. I think, you know, it was something that, that really intrigued me, like having been in all of these, an associate all this time and working with other teachers, right? I was still really like enjoying the idea of two people, right, leading a classroom and coming together to kind of build out that space. And so that's what I wanted. And when I culture was a big thing for me when I went on my interviews. And the place that I chose, for right out, but I felt a really strong culture, a really warm and inviting culture, where I, as a beginning head teacher, could be adequately supported. When I came in, my interviewers were so kind and understanding, and it was as if I could tell they wanted me to succeed. They wanted me to do well in this interview. It was very different than I might have expected to be, people who maybe were exacting and maybe looking for any flaws. But these people, they wanted me to succeed. And so, yeah, trying to get a feel for the culture when you're there and asking questions about that is really, really, really critical.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And thinking back on my experiences, I could definitely say that there was a place, in this case, Riverdale, that was looking for people that they could help grow, right? So this idea that you weren't coming in as a finished product, right? That they were looking for people that were willing to grow because they were willing to put in the effort and the resources to help you grow. And so for me, it's a slightly different because I never actually applied to be like a head teacher per se. The two opportunities that I had were both in school. One of them happened not to work out because the teacher decided not to retire, and that was sort of a logistical thing. But then in my case in Riverdale, there was in many ways, there was a push from the school to invite me to sort of into that space, right, into that position. So I have a slightly different experience in that regard. But like I said, this idea of showing that you're willing to grow, that you're willing to push yourself, that you're willing to learn is something that it just goes such a long way. And there's a difference between saying that and actually doing it, right? So this idea of what have you done to show that these words are actually backed by actions was a huge thing for me. And so I think aside from that is like this idea of culture, right? Like, how do you feel when you walk into a school, right? When you walk into a classroom to do a demo, how does it feel, right? How does it feel to have a conversation after that? What are the kind of questions that these people are asking you, right? Are they asking you a little bit more about yourself, or is it just about the curriculum? And I think those are big things to look out for.
I think I remember it very concretely because I've also last year, I went through the hiring process again for a different role. And so first thing for both being an associate to a lead and a lead to a learning specialist is being very upfront with your administration about what you want so they can support you. So if you're becoming a lead teacher, being like, I really want to become a lead teacher. If it's not here, it's somewhere else. And even with my previous job, I was really upfront about my goals, not necessarily, I didn't want to be a part of this community. This is a role that I really want to take on so they can support you. And then I remember polishing up my resume, having my administrators look it over, my co-teacher, any educator that I knew that I trusted their opinion. And I'd been through a couple of hiring committees at that point. And then also checking the NYSAIS website every single day to see if there's a school listing your position. And if it is a school culture, it's a school that you're interested in working at, and making sure that you can really research that school, tailor a cover letter that matches why you want to be at that school. It shouldn't just be a generic, I want to work at your school, but really understanding why you want to be there, and then just sending those off and hopefully getting some sort of response, and really just checking that job site every day. It was really fun. I remember it being a really fun, exciting time in transition.
Great. If you're hearing anything in the background, my apologies. The phone, of course, has gone off, and the answering machine. So never mind. I would love for you, New York City living, I would love for you to talk about what you know candidates can expect from the hiring process. Not so much a step-by-step, when you're preparing for a teaching demo, what should you think about, etc. So if Domingo, if you can go first, Mallory second, and then Michael third.
Sure. I think you can expect to be extremely nervous, right? There are going to be a lot of feelings that you're going to have about the process, about the demo. I think ultimately what you can do is just prepare as much as you can, understand that there are going to be things outside of your control. And so what can you do in that moment, right? So if you try to anticipate as many things as you can in that moment, and I'm talking particularly about the demo because I think it's a huge deal for teachers and specifically as a job, right? Like this is the first time that they're seeing you in your element, right? You're teaching. This is what they're hiring you to do. And so just prepare as much as you can. And then also bring a part of yourself, right? Ultimately, teaching is one of these professions that you have to bring a part of yourself into the job. There's no way that you can hide that, right? They're going to see it in your demo. The kids are going to feel it when you're teaching them. And so I think that's a huge part of it. And so other than that, I think just try to polish yourself as much as you can, try to answer your questions, have people do mock interviews with you, even talk to yourself in the mirror, right? Just like answer questions that you feel like they're going to show up in an interview. And I think the job fair does a good job of like giving a lot of resources around that, right? This idea of anticipating questions. What does your resume look like? And so just try to, gather as much resources as you can, and then ultimately prepare as much as you can. And then just understand that if you gave your best effort, some things are just not going to work out. And that's just the way it goes, right? But that doesn't mean that you didn't put the effort in and that you went home feeling some sense of regret because you didn't prepare, right?
As Domingo said, you'll be nervous. Take a deep breath. I think my best observations or demo lessons have been when I've completely forgot about the adults in the room, focus on the kids, be prepared, be flexible. They're really looking to see if you, as Domingo said, you can prepare a lesson that's developmentally appropriate, that you can be flexible, that you have a good demeanor with the kids. I've been on hiring committees. I had a candidate once who really almost yelled at one of our students. We did not invite him back, but that's what they're looking for. That's an immediate, no, this person's not right for our community. Take your time. One thing about the hiring process is that they're going to ask you questions, answer them really authentically if you can. A lot of hiring committees will ask you a diversity or equity-based question. I've had candidates who really couldn't answer that question in a meaningful way. So be prepared to offer something from your own teaching experience, from your own educational experience that fits the question. Even if you're a person of color in a predominantly white space, you might want to speak to that if it's not necessarily being a teacher of color with your students. And try to relax and have fun. You're getting used to seeing if this is a community you want to be part of too. As Michael and Domingo were saying, it's about culture.
Yeah, I think when to speak to demo lessons, contacting teachers, right? If you're wherever you're interviewing, whatever grade level, and thinking about asking about what they're teaching, their curriculum, so that you can, if it's something that students they've spent a ton of time doing, maybe you don't teach that because they might be bored with that day, or or that could be an opportunity to go towards something that they're familiar with, but take it in a new, different direction. Extend students in a way that they never have they haven't seen before. I'd say be prepared for many multiple interviews. You might go in and you'll speak to the learning specialist. You'll speak to all of the teachers in the grade level. You'll speak to you might speak to all of those people all at once. You'll speak to the head of lower school or middle school or K to 8. You might speak to the head of school, right? It could be broken up, but I've also been on interview situations where I spoke to all of those people. So be prepared for a slate of interviews. Get your sleep the night before. Yeah, and I would say be confident, have fun. Like you'll feel the nerves, but once it's showtime, you've been doing it, and be ready and come with good questions. They want to know that like you're you know, your thinking, and like if you can put them, you know, in a place of thinking about their school with some of your questions, they're like, oh, this person is sharp. Like they think about what schools should be like. So come with some good questions as well.
Excellent suggestions. I want to step back for a second because I want to clarify. There are assistant or associate teaching positions, which are you're working with a mentor teacher or a lead teacher or a head teacher. And then there's the lead teacher. And then there are co-teaching positions where there are two co-lead or co-head teachers. And each one is different. And so make sure that you as a prospective candidate know the differences, and that you ask for any clarification if necessary. Read those job descriptions really carefully. If you know anybody at the school that you are pursuing employment, it would be great if you reached out. If you are wondering if a co-teacher is the same thing as an assistant or an associate teacher, and you don't want to ask them, you know, someone at the school, there are always ways for you to get information. And I'm just reminding everyone, you know, the support that I offer in candidates to prepare for the job fair also extends beyond the job fair, because the best candidate, if you really want to know how you distinguish yourself, it's everything that Mallory, Domingo, and Michael have said, and that you continuously ask questions and get the information that you need so that you are fully prepared. The worst thing you could do is to go into any of our schools not knowing the mission, not knowing language and words and understanding about our schools and what makes them special. They all have incredibly beautiful, thoughtful, eager young people within them, for sure. And each one has a slightly different feel to it. And so, you know, our panelists are talking about culture. Get a sense of who you're going to be working with. Ask them questions. That was a great suggestion, Michael. And ask, you know, what's your favorite thing about here? Can I upgrade that question? Because I've had that question asked a million times, and the easy answer is what? The kids. Right. We all know that. So change that question. Other than the amazing kids or young people or students that are entrusted in your care each and every day, what else do you enjoy, or what's a highlight for you, or what do you appreciate most about being in this community, or something along those lines? Know to separate the students, because they will always be the reason, or more than likely will be the reason, for sure. Last thing that I would love to ask you all to reflect on is, you know, there's that question, what would you tell yourself today as a candidate starting to make the transition? Like, what advice would you give yourself if you were an assistant or associate teacher today making the transition to a lead or head teacher? What sort of advice would you offer yourself to you know, be able to secure that position? Mallory, I'd love for you to go first, and then Michael, and then Domingo.
Sure. I think putting yourself out there and networking is really important. So I've taught professional developments, and I've had associate teachers saying, Mallory, I loved going to your PD. Do you recommend that I apply to your school? Or they've mentioned my name when they were applying. So really networking, following up with people, connecting, and maintaining those connections are really important, because Michael and I were saying, Brandy, I spoke to Brandy last year, like, you just keep those connections going, you talk to people, and just refer back to it. So if I get an email saying, Mallory, I really enjoyed seeing you at the NYSAIS panel, do you recommend me applying for a job at your school? That's what I'm talking about. I think really those sort of moves are really important, because the New York City Independent School, it seems like it's big, it's small. It's really small, and everyone knows each other. So if you have a really good experience, other people can advocate for you. They know you and they know what you're about. So I think maybe that's the advice I'd give my former self.
I think that's great advice, right? The networking piece is critical. One piece of advice that this is a tough one. One piece of advice that I'd give myself is, I guess I would say, know that, you know, there's all of these, all independent schools kind of, they glitter and shine, you know, and there's they, you know, they look really good. One thing I've learned and being at multiple schools, there's no such thing as a perfect school, right? And you will encounter, you know, a school and their best self, just like you're putting your best self forward, you're going to encounter their best self. And know that um, you're going to come in and even what they're presenting you, like there's going to be challenges underneath that, and come in with high expectations, but also realistic ones as well, right? Know that there, you'll come into a space with some challenges, and like Mallory's been saying a bunch of times, like what do you know, what do you want, what you want to get out of this experience, so that when you come into a space and maybe those expectations aren't being met, right? You know how to advocate for yourself when you're there. And if they are being met because you knew what you were trying to get out of it, then you know that you can keep the main thing for you in these spaces. Because especially these days in all teaching, right? It's always been a hard job, and even now. So what is your why? What why do you want to be at this school or any school? And if that's being taken care of, and then you're good. Yeah. So but right, there's no perfect school, and you think sometimes the grass is always greener, right? We're all at different schools, right? But it's not always, it's not always greener. But yeah, I'll say that.
Those are great perspectives to hear. To me, it's understanding this idea that you're never truly going to feel ready to take the step, but you have to take it, right? Ultimately, at some point, you have to make a decision that I'm going to take the step and I'm going to experience this. And if I get that job, I'm going to make the best of it that I can. And maybe it won't be for you, right? But ultimately, you have to take that step. And I think that's something that happened to me. I was always a person that I like to think to myself as a reflective person, right? And I understood what it meant to be a head teacher. I saw it. I saw people go through it and be really beaten up by the experience of all that pressure and all the time that they had to invest. And so I had to ask myself, is that something that I want? And ultimately, I had to take the step and say, yes, I'm going to try this. And I couldn't be happier. So I think that's, for me, a piece of advice. Take the step.
Thank you all for that. I would add, you may not get the job that you think is your dream job, and you may not get the second or third or fourth either. And what I would say is that for every experience that you have, from the second you begin to read the job description, you prepare your materials, you prepare for your interview, you prepare for that initial conversation, you prepare for the process, the demo lesson, the Q&A afterwards. Always be ready to reflect and think, how could I have done this better? What did I learn from this experience that I can apply the next time? Many hiring committees will ask questions like, we saw your demo lesson, tell us what you did really well, what you really liked, what you felt worked. What would you do differently? That's often a question. And then the third question is often asked, what will tomorrow look like? What will the extension of that learning look like? Because as a classroom teacher, you always do have the next day, or the week later, or whatever it might be. So those are a couple of other additional tips. We've received a couple of questions, so I want to pose these, and I'm going to do these. You all can, take yourselves off mute and answer in no particular order. There's a question: do most hiring committees want to hire experienced teachers, or for openings, or support associate teachers becoming head teachers? What are your thoughts on this, knowing that these are your opinions, you're not speaking on behalf of your institutions, et cetera? it's a question. What's your reflection now that you're in these schools and in these roles? Now, don't all speak at once.
I'm happy to answer first. I think there's been a shift the last couple of years from what I've spoken to admin and colleagues around the space, that this idea that it's actually in many ways beneficial for the school to have a known commodity, this person that knows the school, knows the culture of the school, and we've seen you teach. We believe there's something in you that can continue to stay at the school. And I think that's shifting a little bit. So I think this idea of going from an associate to a head teacher at the same school is something that's shifting, at least from my perspective. And so, but I think there's still trepidation, right? Some people like to know that you've been a head teacher for 5 years, right? And that you can handle this. And so we don't have to worry about that. But I think the last couple of years, I think there's been a little bit of a shift to have somebody that they know, somebody that they've seen teaching, and somebody that knows the culture actually is a beneficial thing to have.
Yeah, to add on to that, I definitely think that there are some schools that really don't prefer to hire their own associate teachers. There are some schools that like to train up their own associate teachers to become lead teachers. That's part of the program. They love to have you there. And there are some schools that they won't hire their own associate teachers, but they'll hire other schools' associate teachers. And sometimes that's nice for you because you get to be a lead teacher in a different environment. So you don't have to say like, oh, people don't still think of you as being an associate teacher. In terms of experience versus being an associate, sometimes people in schools prefer associates because an experienced teacher may have their own sort of understanding of what they want the school to be. They have a really strong background and really strong opinions, where they feel like associates are more open to new things, trying new things, being in a new environment. So I think there's pros and cons, but if you're an associate teacher, as Domingo said, don't be afraid to take that step just because you're an associate. It happens. People do make that transition. So just go for it. Just try it out.
I'd agree. I think it really does vary at, school to school. You may have some of your, blue blood, Ivy League, independent schools who really want a short thing. And then you have some maybe more newer, more progressive ones who are eager to, to try out different types of teachers and varying experience. And it also depends on what the school wants, what they're looking for, right? As we know, many schools, they're wanting more diversity in their teacher in their faculty body, and so you're not always gonna get a very super experienced teacher in that way, right? So you have to be willing to hire an associate, and that's also very much so one of the ways that teachers of color rise up through the ranks is through the associate ranks, right? So you have to be willing to have associates in order to have diversity. So yeah.
Thank you so much. So there's a question around professional development and how to include it on resumes. I'll answer this pretty quickly because the follow-up is, if there's a professional development experience that you have had that is a must, that you would really recommend, what would that be? So that's the question for each of you. While I answer the question, how do I include professional development on a resume? You can certainly put professional development experiences or just professional development. It depends on how you've labeled your different categories, and distinguish between attending something and make sure that it's relevant and that it doesn't extend, into the third, fourth, fifth, sixth page. That nobody needs that. If you would like to have a running list of all the experiences that you have had, that's great. Have that as a side document that you constantly see the body of work in your professional journey. That's a great idea. It doesn't need to be included in a resume. Look at the job descriptions and identify the professional development experiences that you've attended that are relevant. For instance, if they're doing foundations and you've attended, that would be a really good one to put. If Teachers and Writers Collaborative is one that's highlighted in the job description, you might want to indicate that information. I would also say that if you haven't, all of our schools at some point invite their internal colleagues to perhaps offer a learning experience or apply for a conference to serve as a panelist or as a conference organizer, a conference workshop offering a workshop. That's also incredible professional development, because it's one thing to talk about participating in something. It's another thing to prepare to teach other adults who are in the same craft as you are. And that's incredible growth, particularly when you get feedback from your peers. So differentiate between attending, presenting, and now I'm turning it over to you. What are the absolute like go-to? And for those of you that have asked that question, we're going to get real specific. Whoever wants to go.
Can I jump in? For me, it's the Interschool Leadership Institute, ILI. It's an incredible, put the link in the chat, right? They're having an open house coming up soon, I think on the 23rd. So, but they have incredible leaders, and they teach you about what it's like. They teach you about independent school culture there, and what it's like to be a leader if you're not an administrator, right? What it's like to be in predominantly white spaces, right? If you're as a person of color, what will that culture look like? How to be a resident leader, right? I'm telling you too much already, right? Like it's incredible. It's incredible, and you learn how to be. I won't say anymore. ILI, if you can do it.
I'm happy to jump in here. In regards to sort of a bigger picture view, I think the People of Color Conference was super formative for me. It was POCC, and if you have an opportunity to go, I would highly recommend. I know this time has changed a little bit, so that culture of being around people and educators who've been in the space for a long time might not feel the same, but it was super formative for me. And then more specifically, like in terms of like an academic, I really enjoyed spending time with Metamorphosis learning communities. I think they're mostly math based. And I'll put that link in the chat. And I had some really amazing workshops there in math.
I think for me, the combination of things I've presented and things I've chosen to do. So I'm thinking back my own resume, what I really focus my professional development on. It could be a lot of literacy, a lot of special education and things like that for my future goals. So let's say you really want to get better teaching writing. So making sure that you have a few different writing PDs on your trajectory. As an associate, you have many years in the future. So thinking about that long term and what you want those PDs to be a goal for. And of course, the NYSAIS Diversity Conference at Mohawk pre-COVID was very powerful. So connecting with your fellow independent school peers. Unfortunately, I don't have a link to drop in the chat like Michael and Domingo.
We were overachievers.
The last thing I would say that would be really great is it's excellent professional development to shadow a colleague. A colleague at your own school, that's one option. A colleague at another school. It is a fantastic investment of time and of learning and of reflecting in your own praxis. So that would be another suggestion. I am really grateful to Mallory, Domingo, and Michael for your time, for your talent, for your wisdom, for your reflections, and for your suggestions. I hope that those of you that are viewing either live or after have found this conversation about transitioning from assistant associate teacher to head or lead teacher to be really helpful, really useful. As always, please make sure that if I can be helpful, you email jobfair@nysais.org. I am happy to follow up with you. A reminder to everybody, the NYSAIS Job Fair to Promote Diversity is on Saturday, February 26th. We're about like 9 days out. And if you have not registered and you're listening to me, you need to register. And the reason why is because schools are going to gain access to resumes early next week, which means the interview process will begin for many. As they are reviewing, they will begin to reach out. They will schedule conversations in many cases, and some they won't. But you want to make sure that you've done everything you can, and that begins with a flawless registration process. So please complete it in the next few days. We look forward to welcoming you virtually on Saturday, February 26th from 10 to 2. And meanwhile, thank you to Marcy, one of my colleagues from NYSAIS. Thank you for your support. To all my colleagues at NYSAIS, I appreciate you. To everyone who has attended this evening, thank you so much, and who has viewed this. And of course, to Michael, Domingo, and Mallory, Thank you so much for what you do on behalf of our kids and in our schools each and every day. We really appreciate your time.